Welcome to the latest Hear from the Experts webinar. Today's topic, workplace challenges and accommodations when you have MS. This series is helping people better understand multiple sclerosis and provide tools to help navigate their MS journey with more knowledge and confidence. Our intention is to help you learn more about the disease, about research, wellness, and much, much more. My name's Gabrielle Vito, and I'm so pleased to be here with you today. I'm a longtime volunteer with the MS Society of Canada since my own diagnosis back in 1996 with relapsing remitting multiple sclerosis. In my working life, I was a reporter in the TV news industry in Vancouver. I've been home on a disability pension since 2003 when I had to stop working completely. My current roles with the MS Society include helping out on webinars like today. I sit on the BC and Yukon Regional Council, and I also sit on the executive for the MS Ambassador Program. So it's a real privilege for me to be helping today and learning alongside you. I'm coming to you today from the beautiful town of Parksville on Vancouver Island in British Columbia. Now, before we get started, we need to briefly go over a couple of housekeeping items. Your microphones have been muted and will remain muted for the entirety of today's presentation. This webinar is being recorded. After we add French subtitles, it will be available in approximately a month, so you can go back and review it or share it if you'd like to. If you have a question during today's presentation, please at any time type it into the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. For those of you joining us today via Facebook Live, you can type your questions into the chat box. We will try to get to as many questions as possible following today's formal presentation. Now, please note that questions pertaining to specific personal situations cannot be answered in this type of venue, and we always recommend that you contact your personal MS healthcare team or perhaps contact the MS Knowledge Network for your specific situation. Also, please note that the MS Society of Canada does not approve, endorse, or recommend any specific product, therapy, or service, but provides information to assist individuals in making your own decisions. Now, today's presenter is Emily Eusta. She is the service lead of the Canadian Council on Rehabilitation and Work Accommodation and Inclusion Management. She's worked for the CCRW for more than 10 years and has a master's degree in public policy and administration. Emily has extensive experience working with employers, employees, and job seekers in all aspects of workplace accommodation. Welcome, Emily. Thank you for being here. Please take it away.
Thanks, Laurie. Thanks, Gabrielle. So let's just get started. Okay, so thanks for the introduction. I am here today to discuss workplace barriers and accommodation. As Gabrielle indicated, I am the service lead for the CCRW Accommodation and Inclusion Management. So in terms of agenda, I'll go over a brief introduction of who sort of CCRW and AIM is and what we do. Then I'll move on to look at workplace barriers and accommodations. And then I'll dive into a little bit of the legal aspect and the duty to accommodate. And then we'll finish up by looking at accommodation in action and a few scenarios. So CCRW, we are a not-for-profit organization with the mission to promote and support the meaningful and equitable employment of people with disabilities. And we offer a variety of programs and services for both employees and employers geared to all stages of employment. So that can be pre-employment, people that are looking for work. It can be people that are in all stages of employment. They may be in the job search process, they may be looking at what they want to do, or they may be in the role themselves. So we have different programs geared towards sort of different things, and we are sort of Canada-wide as well. So the service I work for, we're one of the services at CCRW, and we are called the Accommodation and Inclusion Management AIM service. And what we are is a service for employers and employees seeking assistance with accommodations. AIM delivers proactive solutions to improve the management and implementation of workplace accommodations. And one of our sort of hallmarks is that we do offer a demedicalized approach, focusing on obstacles and barriers experienced rather than sort of the specific medical diagnosis, and sort of regardless of the specific medical diagnosis. Some examples of the way that AIM, examples of sort of services that AIM has include support identifying and delivering workplace accommodations for both employers and employees, collaboration with organizations to identify customized accommodation options and solutions, as well as small and large scale reviews and audits and guidance of organizational policies, procedures, and practices related to the inclusion of people with disabilities. So, going into sort of the meat of the presentation, looking at workplace barriers, they can be visible or invisible. They can be consistent, so something that's the same all the time. They can be temporary. For example, somebody has a broken arm or something that's very temporary. And they can be episodic, so people's barriers may change, depending on many different factors and be different at different times. They can also impact some or all aspects of the role or job tasks, and they can present themselves at any time, and they may change over time and or if the job changes, such as if you change the location or the job tasks, anything related to that. And what are accommodations and adjustments in the context of the workplace? So, accommodations are reasonable adjustments in a workplace which enables individuals to perform their job. Similar to workplace barriers, they can be something that's temporary, ongoing, and or change throughout the employee life cycle. And there's many different types of accommodations, equipment, strategies, modifications, etc. And one way to categorize them is soft versus hard accommodations, which I'll look at in the next few slides. So, hard accommodations. And just to give a description, there's three photos at the bottom. There's a photo of a computer monitor, a photo of a wrench, and a photo of a large print keyboard with yellow keys on a black background and black writing on those keys. So, hard accommodations are overall anything that is physical or that can be purchased. And it's important to note that even still, there can be sort of hidden elements. For example, for a vertical mouse or adaptive technology, these are all things that can be purchased, but the individual may need additional time to implement them. For example, training. They may need sort of relaxed productivity targets as they get used to using some of these items. And some of the other sort of examples of hard accommodations include sort of the one we all think of, I think, is furniture, such as, ergonomic furniture or workstation accessories, assistive devices or adaptive technology. And some examples of adaptive technology would be speech to text, like Dragon, text to speech, such as Kurzweil or WordQ, screen readers such as JAWS, and screen magnification software such as ZoomText. And one of the other sort of elements of under hard accommodations would be sort of the structural changes, which can be major or minor, but some examples would be adding a ramp or a handrail in a washroom, or it could be adding something to a workstation, such as increasing the barrier of the workstation to give more privacy. And it could also include addressing the environment, such as dust, humidity, heat, cold, things like lighting, things like that. The next type of accommodations are under sort of soft accommodations, and these are items that typically can't be purchased. So, It's something such as flexible hours or breaks, additional time to complete tasks, or understanding that tasks may be completed in a different way and allowing for that. Work from home, which I know with COVID is a little bit more common, but it was something in the past that was, more of an accommodation often. Some other examples could include modifications to performance targets or job duties. It can even involve things like time for stretching or exercises, time off for medical appointments, or things like job coaching. And again, there's some items that sort of don't fall in any particular dichotomy or particular area. For example, somebody may have, an application, like an app downloaded for, something like memory loss, organization, or time management. And that's something that you could physically download, but then they would also might need strategies or training or additional time as well, to sort of utilize those and the ability to use those throughout the day. So the next element that I wanted to touch on is the aspect of disclosure. So, the definition is typically in a workplace when an employee or job seeker informs their employer of barriers experienced and or requests accommodation to enable them to do their work effectively. It doesn't necessarily mean disclosing what your disability is. It doesn't necessarily include saying all medical aspects, but typically it would be disclosing that you require something, whether it's an accommodation, whether it's, you just want to disclose to see what the options are. So it can mean a bunch of different things. Some of the common questions that I see and that our group sees with sort of related to disclosure are sort of, should I disclose? And, that's a difficult one because, first of all, sometimes it's not a choice. Sometimes it's something that's very visible. So, it's clear that, there's nothing there might need to disclose sort of specific needs, but it's visible. And sometimes it needs to be disclosed because you might need accommodations in order to do the job, or even to ensure that the interview or the application process itself is accessible. In terms of the question, should I disclose? It's a difficult one to answer because it really depends on a lot of different factors. There can be there can be a lot of advantages and unfortunately sometimes drawbacks as well. It really depends on the environment. And that's like part of the work we do at CCRW is that we want all workplaces to be places where people do feel comfortable disclosing and not just when they really, are desperate and need something, but, more proactively, and where if the employer is proactively asking everybody, hey, is there anything that you require? Like, is there any accommodations that would make things easier? So a lot of our work is with, ensuring that employers are also doing those aspects so that people are comfortable disclosing and, it's not sort of a big production as well. The other question that's often asked is, when should I disclose? And again, hopefully it's not too annoying of an answer, but it really depends. It really depends on sort of, it might not be a choice. You may require them sort of much, right away in order to do the job. Sometimes people do wait and see what sort of the atmosphere is like and whether they need anything. But legally, you can disclose and request accommodation at any time. So you don't have sort of just one chance and it's done. You can disclose at any time. And some of the main advantages of disclosing is that it does give you access to accommodations and sort of starts that process in motion. So that's the main benefit. And so that's why it's, the main advantage there. So looking at sort of the legal aspect, legally employers must make every effort short of undue hardship to accommodate an employee who comes under the protected grounds of discrimination within human rights legislation. So that includes disability as well. And undue hardship, it's a difficult term to describe, but basically it is the limit beyond which employers and service providers are not expected to accommodate. And there are three main considerations: health, safety, and financial. And again, to reach that undue hardship, it really depends on a lot of different factors, including sort of the size of the business and things like that. So, there's not, unfortunately, a clear-cut definition of what the limits are in each of those three. The duty to accommodate exists only when the employee makes their needs known. So again, that's sort of the advantage of disclosure, is that you're making your needs known. So the roles and responsibilities sort of in the, not just disclosure, but in the accommodation process, I've divided it here into employer and employee, but it can be sort of a variety of different things. But I've just sort of, for the purposes of today, divided them up this way. But for the roles and responsibilities for the employer, it's important that they ensure that employees are aware of their right to accommodation. It's important that they grant any accommodation request in a timely manner, and again, reasonable manner to the point of undue hardship. Another responsibility is to obtain expert opinion and advice, whether that's designated human resource or health specialists, or an organization like CCRW as well, when necessary. So they're not just able to say, "Oh, I'm not sure," and sort of move on. They're expected to sort of do due diligence in that regards. Another really important element is it's expected that they keep information, including medical records, confidential, and be willing to review or modify accommodation agreements if the circumstances change or the solutions are no longer working. And that's sort of, again, it's not just a one and done thing. It's, accommodations change over time. And it's important that there's sort of check-ins to sort of see where things are at and see whether there's anything that's needed. And another responsibility is to provide details to justify decisions if sort of an accommodation has been denied. The employee sort of has a role in the accommodation process as well. Some important aspects. They have a responsibility to request accommodation when needed and suggest appropriate measures if possible. And that is possible, as sometimes people aren't sure, and it might be something that they need further advice on. So that's fine. So it's more suggest appropriate measures if you are sure, and if you do have some suggestions. Another important aspect is, actively participating in discussions regarding possible accommodation solutions. And it includes listening to and considering any reasonable accommodation option that the employer proposes. And another aspect is to achieve sort of the agreed upon performance standard once accommodation is provided. They're also expected to work with the accommodation provider if appropriate, and if it's something that's present in the workplace. Not all workplaces have them, but if they do, to work with the accommodation provider, to manage the accommodation process. And another important element is to advise the employer of changes in accommodation needs. So the accommodation process really depends on the organization and where you're at, in the employment stage as well. Are you a new hire? Are you in the recruitment stage? Have you been there for a while? But here are some sort of very basic elements of often how it sort of looks. Often the employee will inform manager or HR that they require accommodations. The manager and or HR works in collaboration with the employee to determine accommodation options. The accommodations are implemented in a timely fashion. And then it's important to allow time after the accommodations are implemented before evaluating effectiveness. Often things take time, both to see if they're successful, but also to ensure that you're giving it enough time to see if it's actually making a big difference as well. Even for something like a chair, like it may take a while to make sure that you have all the adjustments correct, and then for other aspects, it may take longer. If you have an adaptive technology, at first it's often slower because you're just learning to get used to it. It might be a new way of operating your computer or something like that, and you might need training. So, it might take, 4 to 6 weeks is probably actually a fairly short period of time in that situation. So it's important to allow some time and for there to be check-ins to see how things are going. So the next part of the presentation, I wanted to look at accommodations in actions. So I'll present some scenarios of barriers and challenges, and I'll ask them sort of as a question, and then I'll sort of respond in the next slide to sort of show how they were addressed, to just showcase examples of workplace accommodations. So scenario one, Anna had to use the washroom frequently and had barriers related to mobility. What accommodations or adjustments would help? So again, it really depends on a lot of different factors, but here are some that could help. Flexibility and additional time for washroom breaks, in particular because needed additional time to go to and from the washroom. So to get there and back due to some mobility concerns, it did take a little bit longer as well. So it was important to factor that in. Another thing that helped was to make sure that her workstation was closer to the washroom, so to minimize the distance traveled. And making sure she's seated with her team still and everything like that. But if it works for her as well, maybe looking at, can we move the location so that it's less of a barrier? For in-person meetings, they looked at, during sort of the larger ones like team town halls and things like that, they made sure that she had a chair near the door, just so that she would allow for easy access to the door and easy exit, and to discreetly exit and enter when needed. There was also an understanding that she may have to leave during meetings, and so it wasn't sort of questioned. Everybody, was aware of that aspect. In the Zoom world, there was an understanding that she may need to sort of briefly check out of the call and check back in as needed. So the second scenario I have here is Danielle has a disability, but indicated she did not require accommodations when accepting the new job. However, a few months later, she's really struggling in the role, and she approached her manager requesting accommodations. Danielle's manager's response was that he can't provide any accommodations because she did not request them when she was hired. Is the manager correct? So the response in this case is no, the manager is not correct. You can identify barriers and request accommodations at any time. It may even be, even if you've been in the role for 10 years, you can request them at any time. This third scenario I have here is Sasha experiences numbness in their hands and feet, as well as difficulty staying warm, particularly lower extremities. They also experience barriers related to typing and mousing. What can be done to help? So there's a variety of options. And again, it looks like a lot of information, but this is just sort of looking at all the options available. So, one thing that might help is a footrest with heating and cooling options. This does exist. It's something that exists. It has a fan in it, and it has also a fan as well as sort of a heating option. So that's something that can be considered. Another element is to look at, to involve sort of building management to investigate whether there's the ability to close off or cover events, and exploring whether to ensure that the workstation is not in a particularly cold area or an area where there's a draft. It may just be moving to a different one that, is not in that type of area. Some other things that could help, ergonomic items such as ergonomic mouse and keyboard, as well as investigation of less intensive ways to use the computer, such as Dragon speech to text. The fourth scenario I have here is Ralph has an episodic disability and does not experience the same barriers consistently or all the time. Sometimes he requires more days off. Sometimes his mobility and pain is worse or better. Sometimes he needs additional breaks, and sometimes he requires additional time to attend medical and specialist appointments. What adjustments or strategies may help? So in this case, a lot of the response is to do with flexibility. So he could have a flexible schedule if the job allows for that. A start and end time and breaks might be be able to be flexed. flexibility to attend medical appointments. Sometimes this is needed because, especially with specialist appointments, you don't really get a lot of choice in when they're scheduled. You're sort of told this is the date and time. So having an understanding of that is really important. One other thing that's looked at is the flexibility to use available time off options. So often workplaces have sort of a variety of categories. So working with the manager, working with his organization to find ways to balance that out. Adjustment of job tasks and targets to reflect how he's doing currently. So this might differ depending, and it's something that needs to be considered. This is sort of pre-COVID, I think, but ability to work from home when needed, if that's something that's helpful. Um, they might consider an ergonomic assessment and equipment for home office as well to ensure that he's set up optimally to minimize pain and increase comfort, at all times, and help with that. And another important element would be like a conversation and understanding from the manager regarding barriers and adjustments needed may differ. So clear communication on both sides regarding which provides the employer with the updates needed, just from a business perspective, but also respects dignity and privacy on Ralph's part. So that's something that they would need to work together to come up with, a communication system to ensure that there was clarity as well. But where the individual is not being asked to sort of disclose anything personal. So the fifth scenario I have here is Violet sometimes had difficulty waking up in the mornings and feels groggy for the first part of the workday. Working from home has helped by cutting out the commute, but she is still experiencing a lot of fatigue at the start of her workday. Is there anything that can be done to help? So the response here is yes. Violet spoke with their manager and they agreed on a few things. So one aspect that was looked at was adjusting the start time. She was in a role where you didn't need to necessarily be at your desk at 8:30 or 9. So they decided, 10 a.m. would work. And instead, and she shifted her end time to later. The other thing that was implemented was the flexibility to take additional micro breaks in order to get up and stretch to help maintain focus. So just a few extra minutes here and there to allow her to do that. So this is the last scenario I believe that I have on here. So scenario 6 is when Rodney started his role, he did not have any need for workplace adjustments, but 2 years later, things have changed. He is experiencing some new barriers related to vision, is experiencing pain, and needs more frequent breaks. What can he do? So in this scenario, one thing that would help was to advise his manager that things have changed and follow the process for accommodation requests if it's something that's very formalized in his organization. If he knows what specifically might help, having a conversation with his manager to outline that would be recommended as well, and coming prepared with what his suggestions would be. Some other aspects would be additional breaks. Typically, they might have two 15-minute breaks, but he was given flexibility to take more when needed. There might be something such as expert advice, like a workplace assessment. So there's people with expertise in many different areas. We do see sort of people with expertise specifically, for example, in vision-related accommodations and technology. And there's people that have expertise in ergonomics and other workplace barriers and accommodations as well. So it might be a scenario where that would be helpful to have. They might look at something like modified tasks. For example, if he's in a role where, sometimes they have to grab a really large, heavy task cash box, maybe that's just an aspect that he's not going to do anymore because it's not sort of a main element of the job anyways. Some other elements, they can look at things like a larger monitor to address some of the vision concerns, as well as assistive technology and training, such as Zoom text, magnification software. So just sort of wrapping things up, looking briefly sort of at the AIM approach, and just to give everyone a description, there's sort of a long S-shape graphic with different sort of points at each venue of it. So, looking at the AIM approach, the first element is it's a standardized and demedicalized process that builds trust between the employee and team leader. The second aspect of our approach is we deliver proactive and responsive interventions that improve the implementation of accommodations and workplace adjustments. The third element is that we act as a two-way bridge to other programs at CCRW. The next element is that AIM builds organizational disability confidence and competency in handling accommodations. And then the next element of our approach is that we improve productivity by addressing the employee's needs, thereby improving the performance of the organization. And then the last element of our approach is that we leverage accessibility as an asset to build a healthier and more inclusive workplace. So just to sort of sum up, we're here to help. So if you have any interest in AIM services, if you have questions about AIM, if you have questions generally about disability, accessibility, accommodations, anything along there, please reach out and one of our AIM specialists would be happy to connect. And even if you're interested in something that you're not sure whether we can answer, we know sort of everybody at CCRW, and we'd be happy to connect you with the right person. So I have the email up on the screen here. It's aim@ccrw.org, and our phone number is listed there as well. And I'll just finish off by giving my contact information as well. My name's Emily Yusta. I'm the AIM service lead, and I can be reached at ejooste@ccrw.org. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Emily. That was a fabulous presentation. There's a lot to unpack on this topic, and you really laid it out, I think, nice and clearly for us all. We've got a good sampling of questions already coming in, but thank you very much for your presentation because that was super informative. So I'm going to pop over to the questions, and I'm going to go back. I'm going to start with disclosure. You did cover this, but in the case of in the hiring process, this question is asking, does disclosure during the interview often lead to not being selected for the job? I feel like this is where many of us feel we should not disclose for fear of being seen as problematic if hired, then choose to disclose only once hired. Is that something you've come across?
Yeah, and I mean, it is difficult to know. Some people might need to disclose earlier because they require accommodations, and there can be the benefit of if you do disclose earlier, you get to see sort of what the reaction is, and if it's an organization that is supportive of that. But it is perfectly fine to wait as well. There's nothing that says that you have to disclose like immediately, and sometimes it's people are more comfortable sort of disclosing once they're in the role and they've sort of feel a bit more secure. So yeah, it definitely come across, and it's always a question that comes up is like, when is the best time to disclose? The only, I think, caution I would give is sometimes the earlier the better, just because if you need anything, say for training or anything like that, that would really help you optimize your success. It's easier to implement if they know sort of in advance, but yeah.
Right. Makes sense. All right. Next question is about workload. Can accommodations from an employer be reflective of workload? And the example they give is you work less hours as per accommodations, but have the same workload, part-time hours with full-time expectations. Is that an area your group has come across?
Yeah. So definitely. So when I think I talked a little bit about modified targets, and in some places that's really, really formalized, like very mathematical, like you're expected to manage this many case files or take this many calls. But in others, it's a little less formal, like, it's just, you might need sort of an adjustment to your workload or something like that. But it can be it's definitely something that I've seen as an accommodation. And particularly if you're working less hours, that's definitely something that's done. But even if somebody's like working still full-time hours, sometimes the workload is adjusted. It might be the workload overall. It might be sort of differences in deadlines. It might be, particularly if it's like episodic, and understanding that sometimes the workload may be different than others. So it is something that's seen with workplace accommodations. Yes.
So the next question we have is about supports when accommodation is not being provided in the view of the employee. So are there any supports for a person with MS going through a human rights case because the employer doesn't properly comply with workplace accommodations?
I don't know if I can really answer that one. Like supports, like so. Um, if they're going through, I mean, if they're going through that process already, then usually, like I would say, like the first thing is to look at what's available in your organization, like at that level, like what's the ability to escalate there. So if it's gotten to this level, though, I would assume it's sort of something that's already been done. But no, I don't think we offer anything like specific to that scenario, like from a legal
Okay, so
perspective,
your
anyways.
organization is more at the front end. It's to help employees and employers implement accommodations. So I would jump in and suggest to this person that contacting the MS Society through the Knowledge Network is a good place to start, because we do have support programs through the MS Society to help people who want to launch that end of the process.
Yeah, and sometimes I will say that we have been brought in, like for some, like if whether it's like a specific legal process or something else, like in order to like do an assessment, or sometimes do an assessment even of the, like from the legal perspective, like whether any accommodations are needed in that process as well. So we have been involved in that aspect, but just not in terms of like specific advice regarding sort of the legal elements, which it sounds like the MS Society does have some resources there.
So this next question is along the same line, so I'll get it in here while we're there. Does CCRW or the MS Society provide legal assistance and representation for those facing discrimination in the workplace? So we're along the same lines there. Doesn't sound like it.
Yeah, no, we don't specifically have services in regards to legal support. No.
Right. And again, the MS Society doesn't necessarily have a staff of lawyers or anything, but there are referral processes that you can go through, and you can access those through the trained navigators that staff our MS Knowledge Network. So now I'm going to go back to accommodation questions. I have requested ergonomics in the past and been denied. These would be a sit-stand desk, an ergonomic keyboard, tray, chair. What do I need to do in order for these requests to be approved?
I think it really depends on what your organization's process is. If there's like a formal, like some organizations, you have to formally request, or there's like a form to submit, and if that's the case, if it's not getting through, like escalating to see why not. If it's just that your specific manager isn't supporting it, maybe getting some more details. And mentioning that it's a accommodation need. I think it would really depend on sort of what the structure of the organization is, and what the structure of the accommodation process is as well. In some places, very very formalized and very almost legalistic, and in others, it's more sort of a casual request to a manager or something a little bit more informal. So yeah, my advice would be to look at sort of that element and see what what options there are. To ensure that it's addressed.
Specific to your organization. And so this next question is about that as well. Obligations. What are the obligations of the employer to provide reasonable accommodations? And what's the process for me to follow if they fail to do so? So I think you did touch on this at the beginning of your presentation, but it may be worth repeating.
Yeah, so employers do have a legal duty to provide accommodations to the point of undue hardship, which is a fairly high level. So I think like the first thing is finding out what's going on, and like why not, and what the process is there. And maybe the first person to go to is your manager or supervisor, to ask sort of for advice in that regards. There's some organizations that have a separate ombudsman or something like that as well. That's might be anonymous support. It might sort of give advice on where you can go in the organization. That's something seen more in very large organizations, I would say. But typically, the first step is to just see, why not, and then making sure that they are aware that there's a legal duty to accommodate, as a first step, and make sure that it's clear that you're requesting your accommodations, which is something legally that needs to be provided.
So again, this next question is around accommodation and your organization. I'm planning to request an accommodation at work soon, and my company has a well-documented process to go through. I have manager support. Do you recommend I contact AIM if I'm refused? I'm nervous to go through the process, as I had an accommodation refused while on LTD in the past. So when is it appropriate to contact your group, Emily?
You can always contact us, and we can always advise if there's some, if we don't have any specific advice, but you can contact us at any point. There's times where we've been brought in to sometimes work collaboratively with the employer as well. So I would say if you're in doubt, you're always welcome to contact us, either me or one of the other specialists. We have a team of at least 3 other staff as well that are AIM specialists, should be able to help. But if there's a process in place, often the best advice is to go as a first step, go through that and go from there. But you're welcome to contact us at any time, really.
And is there a cost to contacting or using the services of the CCRW?
So in terms of the initial contact, no. We're sort of we provide information. That's a free service, but there CCRW is a mix of various services, so it really depends. But we are always upfront about what we're able to support with. We do have access to things like a centralized funding and things like that, but it really sort of depends on the situation and what field of employment the individual is in. And as I said, AIM is more so geared towards people that are currently employed, but we do have programs for people that aren't currently employed, that they're pre-employment programs, it's employment supports. So we do have a lot of options in that regards as well. And the good news is, if you contact anybody at CCRW, we have a policy where we'll ensure that we put you in contact with the right person. If it's not us, we make sure that we put you in contact with the right person. So we're not just going to say, oh no, we can't help, and there might be somebody else. You can go to the website. No, typically we would make sure that we do sort of a warm intro to somebody that might have the information, might sort of be the best person to speak with at CCRW.
Excellent. That's good to know. All right. The next question is about approaching an employer. As a person with MS experiencing a need for workplace accommodation, what is the best wording to use while in discussion with an employer? I get stuck on words. They often use disability, and I don't like to use that word. I have limitations, restrictions, I need more breaks. So how do I approach my employer in the most positive way? I want them to accommodate me. What's your advice along that line?
Yeah, language is always important. Sometimes starting off with what you're most comfortable with. So saying that I require workplace accommodations. I have workplace barriers, and require accommodations. Some workplaces are a little bit more medicalized, in that they might have a process where they require something like a medical note. Sometimes the word disability can be helpful, just because it's a reference point that people typically understand, oh, this person has a disability related barrier and requires an accommodation. But you don't have to use it, and you actually don't have to disclose any specific medical diagnosis typically. Even in something like a medical note, it's not something that's outlined. It focuses more on these are the barriers, and these are the accommodations that are needed. So framing it in terms of what accommodations might be helpful is sometimes a good starting point. It's like not even just the barriers, but saying like these accommodations would be really helpful, particularly if they're things that are that would be really helpful for you, but that aren't sort of that are fairly simple to implement and things like that. I mean, that's typically your best starting point if that's what you're comfortable with.
Now, the next area I'm going to ask you about, Emily, is referring to the pandemic. We have a few questions from people asking, is it appropriate to ask for accommodation about not wanting to go back into the workplace? Most of these questions are about immunocompromised individuals who've been working at home. Now workplaces are opening up. Employers want them to go back to the workplace, but they're not comfortable doing that. For instance, masks are not mandatory in some of their work sites. So would it be reasonable to request accommodation to continue working from home?
Yeah, it's definitely something that's considered. The definition of even like what a disability is and things like that is quite expansive. So it's definitely worth asking about and making it clear that it's related to a specific barrier as well. Like it's not just like, oh, I don't want to go in. It's making sure that it's framed in a way that I have concerns about returning, and I would ask to work from home as an accommodation. And going from there. I know with the pandemic, some workplaces have something very specific set up. Like they've sort of said, like if you're unable to come in, like here is the process type of thing as well. And it really depends on the role too. Like there are some roles that might require or might be more difficult to work from home than others, and so the bar might be a little bit higher in terms of whether work from home is going to be an issue or not as well. So it really depends on a lot of different factors. But it is an accommodation, and even pre-pandemic, sometimes it was an accommodation as well. Like somebody would, typically the role would be in the office, but the individual was able to work from home as an accommodation, either full-time, part-time, just depending on the scenario. So.
Okay, and then the last area that we've got multiple questions multiple questions about refers to people who have been home for a significant amount of time. They are wondering what's available in terms of retraining and or looking to get back into the workplace. And would be needing accommodations to do so. Is that I think you referred to this in one of your other answers, pardon me, that you do have a department that could help potentially with that?
So, so yeah, like when you've been out of the workplace for a longer amount of time, there's definitely some additional challenges. And many of like our employment programs do have that. Like it's not uncommon for people to sort of have that element. So, we do. It is addressed in a lot of our employment programs. They help with things like job preparedness and things like that, and would go over those elements as well. Um, they don't. I don't. We don't have a specific sort of retraining program, but like what a lot of our employment programs do is make sure that the person is up to date on what things look like now, even in like the application process, because a lot has changed, looking at like current skill set, looking at how things may have changed, from when they were previously employed to now, looking at sort of, how many hours would make sense, considering things like whether they might need to start off with fewer hours and, go from there as a starting point to sort of get reacclimatized. And even things like helping with, like some of our programs, like the way they're set up is that they're sort of to mimic sort of a work day so that you're getting used to, getting up at the same time every day and things like that as well. So yeah, that is something that's considered. Like outside of us, like I know that there are some things like work hardening programs and things like that, that are sort of set up to help like more intensively in that regards as well. Often it's professionals like occupational therapists that are typically doing things like that, I would say. So.
Right. All right, then Next question I have is it's a series of questions actually, and I'm not entirely sure this is in your bailiwick, but it's asking about people with MS having successful applications for LTD when the disease is so variable over time. If the workplace has no short-term disability cover, is there anything else one can access to cover time off due to MS other than sick days, vacation, or unpaid time off? And if one can no longer drive, as a long commute with no accessible public transit alternative, and one's attendance at the office is required occasionally, could one reasonably expect the company to pay? So there's a whole bunch of issues in these series of questions from this person. Are those any of those areas things that your organization deals with?
So yeah, typically not the short term and long term disability and access to funds like typically not so much. In terms of some of the other elements related to driving, we have seen accommodations related to this. For example, like we've had things like modified schedules so that somebody was able to take public transit or that they were able to for example, they were getting a ride in with their husband and they were able to coordinate a work schedule that worked with that as well because the individual is no longer able to drive. In terms of payment, it would really depend on the organization as well. But that is a barrier in a lot of places. I live in Toronto, so I think of like the TTC, and we do have accessible transit as well. But there's some concerns there too with accessible transit because not all of TTC is accessible, and sometimes the accessible transit can be a barrier because it may not show up at the time specified and things like that. I have seen accommodations related to that in terms of like flexibility in start and end time. Sometimes, some employers as an accommodation do sometimes offer some support with sort of transit costs, but I wouldn't say it's super typical. It would just really depend on a bunch of different factors. So I can answer the second part a little bit, but the first part, with the LTD and STD, I'm not really in a position to comment on as much.
Absolutely. And again, I would suggest to this individual that accessing the navigators at the MS Knowledge Network could be a good place to start, especially for your question about short-term disability coverage. The short answer to your first question about long-term disability, yes, I have met and I know of, and I am a person on LTD. There's many, many people in the MS community who are successfully on long-term disability. All right. Well, that I think covers all the questions that we've gotten in regarding the areas that you've been talking about today, Emily. We have a couple of questions that I see there's a note here for Lori to jump in on. Lori, is that something you wanted to do now, or were you going to follow up with those folks after today's webinar?
Actually, those were two questions that were sent to my email that I've added to the list for Emily.
Oh, I get it. All right. Thank you. Sorry. Thank you for clarifying.
No, you're welcome.
So, Emily, the first one here is the role of unions. If you're in a unionized environment, is it possible to support accommodation requests? Have you come across that?
I think it really. So sometimes it depends like on this situation. Like sometimes we've worked like unions have contacted us, as part of the accommodation process, like because sometimes as part of it they want support in terms of accommodating somebody, or in sort of liaising between the union and the manager as well. And sometimes so that is something like we've worked it with before. It really depends on what the relationship is between the union and the employer as well. So sometimes the request comes from the employer and the union is involved as well. So they're a party that's involved in it. And sometimes the request has come from the union as well. So on our side, like we've worked with both, but we'll work like collaboratively with if there's somebody involved, like even if it's like a third party disability provider. Like there's situations where we've gotten requests directly from them. There's other situations where we've gotten the request from the employer and the disability provider was involved, so we worked with them as well. So.
Excellent. All right, then the last question we have is, can a caregiver of a person with MS ask for accommodations to support that role? That's a biggie. I mean, I know caregivers is a huge issue in the MS community. I'm not sure if that's a formalized process through your organization, though, Emily.
In terms of, we have had individuals who required some sort of support, like in the workplace, like throughout the day, and it really it depended on sort of the scenario, but like sometimes somebody would require a support person to come help with different tasks. Usually it was if it was like a specific block of time, sometimes it was required for a longer period of time. Often it was someone that the employee like had support for, like through funding and things like that. It was more about accessing them throughout the workday and providing sort of any necessary, like whether it's a washroom or a room or something else. But that was sort of the employer's role typically in that regard. I don't know if that sort of was sort of the question there. You might be in a
Yeah,
better
I'm not
position to
sure
provide some.
either if they're talking. Yeah, I think if they're talking about being a caregiver in the workplace, exactly what you're talking about would apply. Because they need extra time or flexible time to do their caregiving duties as well. Or if they're a full-time caregiver of a person with MS, I think that then is a different conversation and a different situation. Like you're saying, everybody's situation is going to be so different. So that brings us to the end of the questions we have. Emily, I want to thank you so much for your time today. This has been a huge amount of information, really, really valuable, and a huge, area of concern for the MS community. So thank you so much for your informative presentation. We really, really appreciate it. That is the end of the time for questions. So I'm going to start our little wrap up now. Emily, thank you again.
Thank you.
So wrapping up today, I do want to remind you, like I've already referred to it, about our MS Knowledge Network. It's staffed by trained navigators who provide consistent, quality information and support. You can connect by phone, email, or live chat through the MS Society's website. If you'd like to sign up for the monthly e-newsletter, an MS Navigator can help you do that. When you receive the e-news, you're kept up to date on the latest MS research and treatments, the Society's programs and services, fundraising and volunteer opportunities, personal stories from people affected by MS, and so much more. All of that is delivered right via email to your inbox. Now, we do encourage you to get involved with the programs, services, events, and volunteer opportunities with the MS Society. These days, connecting with each other is more important than ever, and more information is available at the MS Society website, which is www.mssociety.ca. We also encourage you to visit wechallengems.ca to learn about how you can help to raise funds which are needed to maintain our research commitments, our advocacy initiatives, and programming to support those affected by MS. All these support programs we offer would not be possible without the fundraising. Now, very soon you will be receiving a survey by email about today's webinar. We encourage you to fill it out. For the Facebook Live audience, the link to the survey appears in the chat box. All the information collected from the surveys will let us know if today's discussion was valuable to you and what topics you'd like to see covered in the future. It'll only take a couple of minutes. The survey is not that long, and your feedback will go a long way to help us when we plan for future educational sessions. So it's been a real pleasure to be here with you today. I hope you've learned something. I know I have. Thank you for tuning in to today's broadcast. Take care. Bye-bye.